What if the city you live in is sitting on top of another one? What if the sidewalk you walk on every day was never supposed to be the ground at all, but a roof? In America, entire cities have been covered up, layered over, and quietly erased. Not destroyed, not lost, just buried. And yet, no one talks about it. Why? Why would anyone bury an entire city and walk away? This is the story behind a strange, unsettling question. Why are so many U.S. cities being buried? It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. Right now, across America, entire towns, neighborhoods, and city blocks are hidden just beneath the surface. Not abandoned, not destroyed, but buried, covered by dirt, gravel, concrete, and time. You can walk through downtown Seattle, Portland, or St. Louis and have no idea you're standing above another world. Beneath your feet are sidewalks no one uses anymore, doorways that lead into darkness, and buildings that haven't seen daylight in over a century. But the real mystery isn't that these buried cities exist, it's why. Why were they sealed away instead of rebuilt? Why do they still remain? And perhaps most disturbing, why is no one talking about them? There are cities in America that don't appear on maps anymore. Not because they never mattered, but because someone decided it was easier to cover them than to fix them. Beneath busy streets, beneath parks and skyscrapers, entire pieces of the past sit in silence. We like to think of progress as something clean, as something upward, taller buildings, smarter designs. But in truth, America is layered, not just culturally, but physically. Beneath what we build are the stories we tried to forget. Seattle is one of the clearest examples. In 1889, a massive fire destroyed 25 blocks of the city's downtown. But instead of clearing it and rebuilding from the ground up, officials decided to raise the city one story higher, literally. New streets were constructed above the old ones, but they didn't demolish what was underneath. Entire storefronts, sidewalks, and entryways were simply left. Today, many of them are still there, locked away beneath glass, brick, and steel. For a while, people still used the lower levels, but slowly, those spaces were closed off, bricked in, forgotten. They remain today like fossilized ghosts of another time. In St. Louis, the reason wasn't fire, it was filth. In the mid-1800s, the streets were so muddy, so disease-ridden, that the city decided to raise its roadways by several feet. They dumped layer upon layer of gravel, soil, and wooden beams to create new roads. But the buildings stayed put, so the original street-level doors became basement windows. Some staircases now lead nowhere. Whole streets, gone, simply covered up and paved over like they never existed. Butte, Montana faced a different fate. As the copper boom collapsed, the mining waste piled up. It became easier to cover entire neighborhoods with tailings than to dismantle them. So that's exactly what they did. Streets, where families once gathered, were slowly buried under mountains of rock and slag. No one cleared it, they just moved on. None of this happened overnight. These cities weren't swallowed by sudden earthquakes or biblical floods. It happened in slow motion, layer by layer, year after year. Because sometimes, burying a problem is cheaper than solving. And beneath every one of these decisions is a silent message. Move forward and don't look back. But what if we did look back? What if these buried sidewalks, sealed doorways, and hidden buildings weren't destroyed, but preserved? What if right now, underneath our cities, the past is still waiting? Next, we descend underground, into the eerie, fully intact neighborhoods still sitting beneath our feet. What's down there will shock you. If you think the past disappeared, you haven't been underground. Beneath modern streets, a second world is waiting. Not shattered ruins or crumbling bricks, but places that feel paused, quiet, undisturbed. Step into the Seattle Underground and you'll find something chilling. Full storefronts, long-forgotten staircases, iron railings still clinging to sunken sidewalks, dusty mannequins left behind in shops, broken signs from businesses that once bustled with life. It doesn't feel ancient, it feels frozen, like someone just turned out the lights and walked away. There are stretches of old Seattle where the original sidewalks still exist, sunken beneath glass viewing panels built into modern walkways. At first, the lower level was used during Reconstruction. Businesses continued operating down there while the upper city rose above them. But eventually, people moved upstairs. The lights went out below. The windows were sealed, and the lower level was left to rot or survive. In Portland, Oregon, the story goes darker. The Shanghai tunnels, a sprawling web beneath the city's historic district, were once used to move goods between buildings and ships. But local legends say they were also used to move people. Kidnapped men were allegedly dragged through trapdoors and bars, held underground in small cells, then forced onto ships headed to Asia, never to return. Whether fact or folklore, what remains today is undeniable. The cells, the narrow tunnels, the barred grates still exist, silent, cold, covered in dust, as if the ground remembers. Chicago offers something even stranger. In the 1800s, entire buildings were raised, lifted on massive jack screws to bring them in line with newly elevated streets. But not all structures were raised. Some were left half submerged. That's why today, you'll sometimes see a shop where the entrance is awkwardly up a flight of stairs, or a window peeks out near your knees. You're seeing architectural leftovers, clues that what we now call ground level wasn't always the ground. Across these cities, time hasn't erased the past. It has buried it, layered it under dust and darkness, but left it largely intact. You can walk through these underground spaces and feel the weight of stories that were never told. And the strange part? They're still holding up the city above. But not every buried place was sealed by accident. Some were erased on purpose. Entire communities covered, not because of decay, but because of who lived there. Not every buried place was lost to disaster or decay. Some were buried on purpose. Not by time, but by intention. Not because they were broken, but because they didn't fit someone else's vision of the future. Take a quiet walk through Central Park in New York City, and you'd never guess what lies beneath the trees. In the early 1800s, long before the park existed, this land was home to Seneca Village, a thriving community of African-American landowners, church leaders, and working-class families. It was one of the first places where Black Americans could own property, vote, and build lives with dignity. For decades, it stood as a symbol of success, until it got in the way. When city officials decided to build Central Park in the 1850s, they used eminent domain to take the land. Families were forced out, homes were demolished, and the entire village, churches, schools, gardens, was buried under what would become meadows and playgrounds. It wasn't preserved, it wasn't documented, it was erased. And then there's Tulsa, Oklahoma, the site of one of the worst race massacres in U.S. history. In 1921, the Greenwood District, known as Black Wall Street, was a booming black business hub, full of theaters, banks, doctors' offices, and proud homeowners, until it was attacked. Over 2 days, white mobs burned the district to the ground. Hundreds were killed, entire blocks reduced to ash. What followed was silence. Many victims were buried in unmarked graves. The district was never fully rebuilt. Parts of it were paved over, developed, or simply ignored. To this day, investigators are still discovering mass burial sites beneath Tulsa, places the city tried for decades not to acknowledge. This pattern repeats across the country. In Detroit, thriving immigrant neighborhoods were bulldozed in the name of urban renewal. In Los Angeles, Chavez Ravine was cleared of hundreds of Mexican-American families to build Dodger Stadium. In too many cities, it wasn't just buildings that were buried, it was communities, histories, cultures, and often, those places weren't falling apart, they were thriving. It's easier to erase a neighborhood when you convince the world it never mattered. But the past doesn't stay buried forever, and sometimes, what lies underneath still burns, not just in memory, but in fire. Next, we visit a town that's literally been burning beneath the surface for over 60 years. Some cities vanish slowly. In the heart of Pennsylvania lies a town that's been on fire since 1962, a place where the sidewalks crack from underground heat, where smoke rises from the earth, and where an entire community was slowly erased, not by government orders or social conflict, but by a fire that never stopped. This is Centralia. It began with something simple, a trash fire at the edge of town. The landfill sat near an abandoned coal mine shaft, and when the fire was lit, it crept underground, unnoticed at first. But coal burns differently. It doesn't roar. It smolders, slowly, silently, relentlessly. By the time people realized what was happening, it was too late. The fire had spread through the mine tunnels beneath the town. Gas stations reported fuel tanks heating up from below. Basements became ovens. In one terrifying case, a young boy fell into a hole that opened beneath his feet, a sinkhole created by the burning ground. The government tried to fight the fire, but it was too deep, too far-reaching. The only real solution was to leave. Over the next few decades, families were bought out, homes were condemned and bulldozed, roads were rerouted, and gradually, the town of Centralia was buried, not under dirt, but under silence. Today, only a handful of residents remain. Most of the buildings are gone. Nature has overtaken much of the town. But the fire still burns, deep, underground, and may continue for another 200 years. Centralia is more than a tragedy. It's a symbol of how quickly a place can become dangerous, of how fragile the ground beneath us really is, and of how the easiest choice, to bury a problem instead of solving it, can have consequences that last generations. But what happened in Centralia isn't unique. Across Appalachia and the Rust Belt, other towns are sinking, burning, or being slowly erased due to collapsed mines, poisoned land, or unstable infrastructure. And instead of rebuilding, many are just being covered, buried, forgotten. But the most haunting part? It's not just the buildings we bury, it's the memory of what they stood for. And in the final chapter, we'll explore what these buried cities reveal about who we are and what we choose to leave behind. We like to think that history is made of monuments, that it stands tall in museums, taught in schools, carved into stone. But sometimes, history isn't above us. It's below, beneath the sidewalks we walk every day, beneath the stories we tell ourselves about progress. What we've buried and why we buried it may say more about us than any monument ever could. Some cities were buried by fire, by flood, or by the collapse of industry. Others were buried because of who lived there and who didn't want them to. But all of them have one thing in common. They were pushed out of sight, layered under concrete, disconnected from memory. And yet, they're still there. Old doors leading nowhere. Windows half submerged in sidewalks. Iron bars hidden under bricks. These are not design flaws. These are scars. They are reminders that the past is never as far away as we think. And the more we try to cover it up, the more it waits, quietly, patiently, to be noticed again. Beneath the glass panels in Seattle, the fire-stained sidewalks still remember. Beneath Central Park, the echoes of Seneca Village still stir. Beneath Tulsa, the silence of the Greenwood district still demands to be heard. These aren't just places. They are unresolved truths. We buried them because we didn't want to deal with the mess. The ugliness, the mistakes, the injustice. We paved over them with new streets, new buildings, new names, and maybe that made us feel better, but it didn't make them go away. Because you can bury a building, you can bury a community, but you can't bury a legacy. It rises through memory, through discovery, through the cracks in the pavement. So the next time you walk through your city and you see a door that's strangely low, or a staircase that disappears into the ground, or a window staring into earth, ask yourself what used to be here. Ask what was buried. Because if history is buried in layers, then maybe the future depends on how willing we are to dig. If this story made you pause, if it made you see the ground beneath your feet just a little differently, then share it. Because the past only stays buried when we stop talking about it. And maybe the first step to uncovering what we've lost is reminding others it was ever there. Subscribe for more stories like this, the ones hidden in plain sight.